Okay, so what I'm going to talk a little bit about, which obviously complements what Liz has already said, is this idea that children and young people can make really valuable contributions to the kind of conceptualization of characters for science programs. The only other thing, just to mention briefly, Liz has used the term STEM quite a lot. I think that is equivalent to your term MINT, so just in case you were wondering what STEM meant. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about from stereotypes to types. So what I brought to the project was, as a media researcher, was background in particularly the work of people like Stuart Hall. And Stuart Hall in the UK in the 70s and 80s have been really interested in this idea that race and ethnicity was invisible from television. Okay, and when it started to become visible, when characters started to appear on television, they were very stereotypical. So I went back to some of the work that he'd done and looked at how he'd conceptualized those stereotypes and then his solution to it. And his solution was to move towards types. And I think that this could be appropriate for the type of work we're doing now in terms of gender as well, gender and science. So we're now having more visible characters in terms of science. So how do we move from the stereotype to the type? So he conceptualized stereotypes in terms of essentially a closed typology, okay? So you reduce a character to a small number of essential simplified characteristics, and they're kind of fixed, okay? And that's the kind of negative thing about it, because you can't imagine scientists to be other things. So what he suggested in terms of his work on race and ethnicity, and what I think we can do, is to move towards types, okay? So types are also essential to meaning making. But what they do is they allow us to have an open typology. So they allow us to imagine different things, okay? So people can do different things. And then you can position people within these kind of orders of typification. So as a very obvious example, when we see a table, we don't think of a stereotypical table because we've seen so many different tables. We just think, okay, it's a flat surface with a number of legs, okay? It's a table, and it can be lots of different types of table. So it can be this table here, it could be dining room table. We don't even think about it, okay? It's an open typology. It's very flexible. And how then do we move this into television so that we can have more interesting, more idealized images of of scientists on children's television? And the crucial thing about this is that obviously we need to have a shared understanding between producers and receivers. So they need to be able to make sense of the storyline, the images, the characteristics of the characters that we make. And actually our research shows that children can go a long way with this, much further than perhaps producers assume. Okay, so we go back to the work of people like Margaret Mead and Rhoda Matreur from back in 1957. It's amazing that this is still the case. They identified this composite image of a stereotypical scientist. And if you look at the characteristics, I'm guessing you're seeing some things that you see yourself on television. The crucial thing is, I think we can break down these characteristics into different types, okay? So if you look at the first view, we've got a middle-aged male, he's partly bald and bearded, and so on and so forth. These are all kind of images, okay? So we can think about different types of images that may code somebody as a scientist, but you don't have to have all the negative ones. So a white coat may be sufficient, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. We then go into characteristics. So this idea that somebody can be intelligent, patient, open-minded, but also undervalued, overworked and lonely. There's sort of characteristics you can start to think about. What are the characteristics that make up a scientist? And how many of them you actually need for people to be able to understand that it's a scientist on screen? Locations, where do they work? The classic image of the secret underground laboratory. We've already seen Dr. Frankenstein today. I've seen that for preschool children. The Frankenstein story is being told to preschool children. We wonder where children learn that story. It's on television before they've even gone to school. Extraordinary. The type of experiments they use, the type of equipment they use, all these things are characteristics that we can attribute to a scientist. But actually you don't need that many of them to show somebody that you're talking about science on television. So I'll just do a quick example or two. Okay, so this is one for preschool television. So this is for under 5-year-olds, okay? Shown on the BBC in the UK. Our research actually looked at more than BBC coverage, but we focused on BBC stuff because that's what we were asked to do. So what we have are two examples here. We have the type and the stereotype. So on the left we have the type. So this is Nina and the neurons. Nina and the neurons is essentially a program where children phone in or write in with questions about science. And Nina does hands-on experiments with the children who come onto the show, and she shows them how it works. And she has her 5 neurons, which represent the senses, so sight, sound, hearing, etc., etc. And she chooses one sense to explain each scientific phenomenon that she shows. So it's quite a kind of classic science show. But as you see, the actual imagery that she has, essentially, it's a white coat with a little bit of embroidery on it. Okay, so that's the only kind of real obvious coding that she is a scientist. And as she goes through it, she breaks down some of the ideas into manageable chunks for the children. She sings songs to them about it. So it's quite a kind of light-hearted format for the children. You compare that, again, this is a preschool program for children with a comedy show. This one is called Giggle Biz, and it's essentially a sketch show of slapstick comedy. And one of the characters, as you see here, is Professor Muddles. And Muddles is that kind of classic 1950s stereotype. He's clumsy, he's dishevelled, he makes a lot of mistakes. I mean, he's the classic kind of stereotypical scientist. Okay, I'll show you one more example. Okay, so this one is for family viewing. We chose this mainly because we figured everybody has seen The Simpsons before. As we live in a globalised media marketplace, has anybody not seen The Simpsons? No? Okay, great. Okay, so what we see here, again, a stereotype and a type. Lisa Simpson does not look like a scientist. Okay, she shows none of the obvious characteristics, imagery that you would associate with a scientist. But if you actually look at the characteristics that she has around her intelligence, her honesty, her curiosity, she is a great advocate for science. And she's done a lot of different storylines around science, but she doesn't look like a scientist. So you can get an awful long way into the science yesterday. I mean, it's along the lines of Andrew's point yesterday about there's so much science out there. You don't actually have to have somebody standing there in a white coat telling you it's about science. She deals with kind of real world problems. She deals with the type of problems that she encounters in her life, in school and at home and in environment and things like this. You compare her with Professor John Frink Jr. on the right hand side there, and what you have is the classic 1950s stereotype again. So he's wearing the thick glasses, he's got slightly crazy hair, he's got the white coat on, he's very muddled, he makes mistakes a lot. It's the kind of classic imagery in that. So what I think we're saying is that there is a real potential to look at the stereotypes, to see which codes you actually need to make sense of science, and to use as few of them if you can, if you like, to actually then appeal more to the young people. Okay, so this brings us to our last slide, which is kind of what can drama do? Now, Liz mentioned at the start this program Silent Witness, which is one of the reasons why we called our project Invisible Witnesses. The picture at the top is the central character in that show, who was a pathologist and conducted obviously various experiments as she went through, various post-mortems, etc., as she went through the show. And what I think we can see is because of people like her and because of the CSI effect and because of lots of the other programs that we've seen and some of the films we've heard of, what we're actually living in at the moment is a kind of mixed economy, if you like, of stereotypical images and types. And I think that there's a real opportunity to move more towards types and to drop some of the stereotypical imagery. Do we actually need it anymore? Ooh. My task is completed. I don't even know what I was doing. So if you move from stereotypes towards types, and the thing which I think we found in our research is you lose nothing by doing this, okay? You actually add value by doing this. People can make sense of this. They can move quite easily from those kind of closed, fixed typologies to the open, flexible ones, and they still make sense of the show. They still make sense of the storyline. They actually enjoy the idealized images, and they can relate more to diversity and representation, because guess what? Half the audience are not men. A lot of the audience are not young. Some of them, guess what, are not beautiful. Do you know what I mean? So we actually start to move on, have more diverse images on television. It's not a bad thing. So I think there's a real call, I suppose, to the kind of commissioned editors, script writers, and particularly in animated cartoons. We found a lot of negative imagery in animated cartoons, to involve children and young people in these kind of commissioning processes, to get them involved. They've got interesting things to say, they've got good ideas, they're creative too. And we've already seen some examples of how you can involve scientists, so I won't labour that. I think we'll finish there.